Good day everyone, and welcome to the channel. It's Londononion here with another Back 4 Blood character build. And the character we'll be building in this video is... Jim. Now generally I would say cleaners fall on a spectrum of roles/categories ranging from offensive, supportive, and defensive. And of course the degrees in between, as we will uncover throughout the series. Just for consistency, I will define offensive roles and perks as abilities that are directly intended to increase damage or bolster offensive capabilities. Defensive roles and perks will be defined as abilities that directly increase survivability from punishment. Lastly, supportive roles and perks are defined as alternative skills that can be instrumentally used for offensive or defensive purposes without a defined intention for either polarization, but are ultimately a helpful perk for one's team. First, we will have a brief overview of our chosen cleaner, go through relevant cards that will either synergize or compensate with their attributes, and conclude with what I consider to be the main tactics to maximize the use of their abilities, as well as my closing statements. Now, for those who were present during our weapon reviews and deck builds, each weapon-centered deck build came with character designations. Our format with character builds will be similar, but with more priority to a given character and maximizing their role on a given team. So starting off with the character attributes of Jim. Upon a precision kill, Jim gains 2.5% stacking damage until damage is received. Although it is unstated, this maxes out at 10 stacks. He has 25% increased ADS speed. Lastly, he has a team effect of increased weak spot damage by 10%. Now, in regards to our spectrum, it is the attributes that we will use to designate each cleaner. In Jim's case, I would classify his stacking damage ability as an offensive perk, his increased ADS speed a supportive perk, and his increased team weak spot damage an offensive perk. With all of that said, I would categorize Jim as offensive support. Now in regards to our card selection, we can compensate with the more defensive cards, and we can synergize with more related and compounding cards depending on needs. And naturally, there is the option of creating a mixture or specialization. But if you ask me, a quintessential cleaner is not one that is good at everything, but one that fulfills the role in the best manner to aid the overall effectiveness of their team. So starting ourselves off with his deck build, I would argue that Jim is rather similar to Hoffman in that he is more so offensively oriented, but without a specialization toward throwables and ammunition, instead cold hard damage. His offense is his defense, and this does create a preliminary path more predisposed to a relatively narrow / one-dimensional build. Based on his attributes and starting loadout, Jim is the designated high-caliber marksman. I personally don't see much need to alter his loadout other than favoring the more hard-hitting snipers, but this will be covered in more detail later in our discussion. Moving on to our card selections, our first card will be Hyper-Focused, which grants increased weak spot damage by 50% but reduces move speed while shooting or melee attacking by 40%. Next, Reckless Strategy increases weak spot damage by 30% but reduces damage resistance by 5%. Following, I employ Tunnel Vision, which increases weak spot damage by 5% for every 0.75 seconds aiming down the sights and stacks 3 times. It also increases aim speed by 50%, but at the same time reduces damage resistance by 5%. Compounding, we have Ridden Slayer, which increases weak spot damage by 20%. Lastly, Knowledge is Power increases weak spot damage by 10% and allows cleaners to see enemy health bars as well as their damage values. Moving on to our general and bullet damage cards. We have March for Death, which grants increased weak spot damage for one's team against mutations by 10% when you ping them. Compounding, I employ Patient Hunter, which is similar to Tunnel Vision, but increases bullet damage by 10% for every 0.75 seconds one is aiming down their sights and stacks 3 times. Lastly, we have Confident Killer, which increases general damage by 1% for every mutation eliminated and stacks 15 times for the duration of a given level. Moving on to our more supporting and defensive cards, we have Hunker Down, which increases damage resistance by 10% and increases accuracy by 40% while crouching. Synergizing with this card, I employ Down in Front, which eliminates both given and receive friendly fire and grants 10 health units. Next, Reload Drills increases reload speed by 20%. Cold Brew Coffee increases reload speed by 15%, aim speed by 25%, weapon swap speed by 25%, and use speed by 25%. Controlled Movement increases move speed by 40% while aiming with snipers. Ammo Belt increases ammo capacity by 50% and reload speed by 15%. Lastly, I employ Admin Reload, which allows your weapon to reload while stowed away. Overall, starting off with his general damage, Jim can theoretically inflict a grand total of 75% increased damage, provided all card effects / conditions as well as his stacking damage are maximized. Weak spot damage will increase by a grand total of a massive 135%. ADS speed will increase by a grand total of 100%. Reload speed will increase by a grand total of 50%. Lastly, accuracy will increase by 40%. Now, we had a few deficits from our weak spot card selections, two of which were a 5% reduction in damage resistance. This is neutralized, however, by Hunker Down, provided one is actually crouching. The movement speed penalty while firing or melee attacking I decided to leave alone. Unless favoring the M1A sniper, the movement penalty in this onion's opinion is negligible, as sniping is not necessarily a run and gun process, and the bolt action feature on the heavier snipers minimizes the slowdown for a very brief period. But this will transition us to the tactical implications of Jim and his placement on a team. Now, as implicated in his deck build, Jim is all about offense, and by extension has a clear role in mutation deterrence. With that said, he is rather narrow in scope, but also unparalleled in his ability to eliminate tough threats, that being mutations and bosses. And I would argue that such a niche becomes more important as one ventures into higher difficulties and progresses through the campaign with increasingly difficult corruption cards. To balance out his build, at most I would consider adopting melee-based cards such as Spiky Bits or Mean Drunk to substitute his secondary. This, however, would mainly be useful in the event of crowds and playing solo. In regards to team gameplay and placement, I would argue that Jim is best for an Omega role, or possibly the Major role, if there is no alternative cleaner as the Alpha's backup, and if employing the M1A and melee weapon for their loadout. Omega is the rear team protection, and their focus is mostly lateral and of course backwards. The Omega is a given cleaner team's anchor. They either grind an imminent threat to a halt from whatever direction, or stand as substitute to an alternative role / be the last remaining stone where others have crumbled. His high offensive capabilities are a testament to this role. Being at the back of a given cleaner team offers a fair amount of protection from where the majority of threats will come from, which is typically the front, while providing overwatch as well as preventing blindside attacks. A blindsided cleaner team is a vulnerable cleaner team. On higher difficulties, this becomes increasingly vital to survival. Now, it may seem odd to have Jim at the back with a dangerous weapon, but this is why I employ Hunker Down, since friendly fire with Jim is extremely hazardous. One would just have to make it a habit to crouch before engaging in combat. Also, as a sniper, he is mainly meant to eliminate key targets that are most threatening to his cleaner team, and having to worry about more common threats like Ridden and Sleepers will hamper his ability to eliminate mutations and bosses efficiently. Similar to Hoffman, Jim can be the difference between a halted threat and a fallen cleaner team. Knowledge is power truly is a useful perk for Jim's team, as this can help determine whether an alpha will direct their team to hold fast or retreat based on enemy health. I don't know about the rest of you, but in my experience, tall boys especially never seem to like dying before they can downswing at least once, regardless of whatever punishment they receive prior to closing the distance. Obviously, that is hyperbole, but with enemy health bars, this phenomenon can be minimized. Mix this with his massive damage increases, and mutation deterrence will become significantly easier with the others as support. As a cleaner that is all stick, he can metaphorically be likened to Bob Swagger from the movie Shooter, Private Jackson from the movie Saving Private Ryan, or Spartan 058 Linda from the Halo universe. Now, everything in this discussion can be taken with a grain of salt, as deck build combinations are too complex for me to fairly evaluate them. However, this is the build I prefer to use when playing on the Nightmare and No Hope difficulty with Jim. Now, it is paramount to state that team maturity is ultimately what makes any deck work, and for those who were present during our last cleaner discussion, I'm using maturity as an umbrella term to describe each individual's general understanding of roles, navigation, character and weapon attributes, Ridden/mutation deterrent tactics, resource management, and ultimately collaboration, as this is a team-based game. I would also argue that the greater one's team maturity is, the greater efficacy specializations, like the one we just went through, will have, as each person will have a greater understanding of what it means to operate as a unit without being overbearing or breaking roles. Carrying on, less maturity will likely demand more of a compensating build, so as to provide support where there are more deficiencies. However, there is far more to compensate with than there is to specialize with, and would create an unnecessarily long discussion. Now, Jim is only one piece of this giant cleaner pie, but this brings us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you guys for joining me on this one, and in our next video, the cleaner of discussion will be Carly, and we will determine where she sits on our spectrum of roles. It's been Londononion, and I will see you guys next time.